Many of you who have been corresponding with me know that I spent a lot of time with my husband and family sailing, and that's our boat and many islands that we sail on. And I showed these pictures last time I was here because when I went through, that's actually the only pictures I could find. Of fishing, my husband and my eldest son fishing about 2 years ago with the birds flying around and the fish breaking the water because we spend a lot of time fishing. Kayaking. I was going to go kayaking in Stockholm this trip, but I'm not now. I'll come next year. And just to show he did catch something. So that's just a little bit about myself. I actually I was a teacher. I'm trained to teach primary school, but before I went to the university, I taught early childhood, 3 and 4 year olds. I also taught in secondary schools for some time and was the principal of a special school for children with special education needs. And then I went into the university for research. But that background for me, I think, has formed my university research career in that I care mostly about the kind of research that makes a difference in practice for both teachers, leaders, and the students, particularly those students that are not well served by our system and don't achieve so well. I've put here, I live in Auckland, and you'll see why the sailing is because we've got many islands around there. And I was with Leif and looking at the northern end of Denmark, and it's not so very different in terms of islands and excellent sailing. I have put here our greatest challenge, educational challenge in New Zealand, because the kind of professional learning I talk about and write about is the kind that makes a difference to these challenges. If you just want teachers to learn something, that's fine. But if what I've been studying is the kind of professional learning that makes a real difference to the outcomes for students. So in New Zealand, we do well on PISA on the whole. The international studies, TIMS, PISA, we participate in all of them. But we have one of the biggest gaps between our highest achievers and our low and the middle and top. We do very well with those groups, but we don't do so well with our lower achievers. We have a large immigrant population. In Auckland, where I live, 1 in 3 people have been born outside of New Zealand, so we have a large immigrant population, and typically it is those immigrants, or some of those immigrants, that do not do well, particularly ones coming from the Pacific Islands. We have Auckland is the largest Polynesian city in the world. We have a lot of immigration from the Pacific Islands, and those students on the whole do not do as well. So when I say that the achievement is stratified along socioeconomic and ethnic lines, I'm referring to the groups that, particularly some of those immigrant groups, are not as well off economically and socially. We also have some poor mental health statistics in terms of youth suicide and bullying. And from my perspective, those young person's mental health is just as important as their academic achievement. And they are related, but not very closely. I think they are both very important outcomes of their own. So what I'd like you to think about with the person next to you is, what is your greatest challenge in your particular situation? I'm not talking about Sweden's on the whole. I'm talking about in your schools or municipalities that you can do something about. Typically in education, we cannot do anything about poverty. We can do something about children's learning who come from poverty. And I wanted to ask you too, would other teachers, if you're a teacher or if you're a leader, would your teachers identify the same challenge? And if not, what would they say? Because it's these challenges that need to be the focus of professional learning if we want to make a difference. So if you spend 5 minutes talking to your neighbour about in your situation, what are your challenges that you would want to be addressed through professional learning? Okay, I hope you've identified something. The reason for that second question is that unless every teacher in your schools believes that challenge is important to address, then nothing is likely to happen. I was asked by our ministry to evaluate a program in literacy some years ago now, and we interviewed the teachers and asked them how satisfied they were with the achievement of the students in their classes. We got incredibly high ratings, about 6, on average, 6 out of a 7-point scale. They were really satisfied. And when we asked them what was the basis for their ratings, they said, well, they always referred to their middle and top students. I've got the best group that I've ever had in the top, and the students are making excellent progress. Only one teacher mentioned the students who are not doing so well. Yet the whole professional development project was designed to meet the needs of those lower achieving students. Needless to say, there was no difference in outcomes after a 2-year intervention. So if you're going to make a difference, then every teacher has to believe that that is what the professional development that they're engaged in is about, in addressing the student-related issues that are important to the system. So sometimes we get policymakers saying this is really important, so teachers should have the professional development to meet it, which was the case in this project. But none of the teachers understood that was the issue. They thought they were just getting some professional development. Which brings me to my next slide, which, is that professional learning and development can be very effective in meeting the sorts of challenges you've just identified, but most of it is a waste of time in improving the academic outcomes for young people, or the social outcomes. And the reason is that someone else has decided that the teachers should learn something, rather than the teachers being involved in the process of identifying what are the issues, what are the challenges, and what do we need to learn in order to meet them. I'm starting with students. Why start with students? Because everything I talk about is underpinned by learning theory. And learning theory applies as much to what we know about students as we know about teachers. Obviously, teachers know more, had many more life experiences, but how people learn is the same for students and for their teachers and their leaders, and hopefully for the policymakers. Okay, that's a classroom that neither in your country nor my country does it look like this anymore. But I want you to think about the processes that are going on there, and how different are they really now than they were before. The international research would show that most teachers still believe that their job is to transmit knowledge and skills to students and give them opportunities to practice. Yet in learning theory, we know that it's much more effective if students have clear goals about what they're learning, so they know where are we going. They know how they're doing in relation to those goals, so that's the co- and self-regulated learning. By co-regulated learning, I mean doing it together, regulating their learning together, and learning through feedback and feed forward about where to next. I was in a classroom recently in New Zealand where every student had their own learning goals. They knew they had the curriculum expectations on the wall. They knew where they were in relation to the curriculum expectations, and they were constantly just monitoring their own learning, and the teacher was the guide. They had to show, when they'd reached a goal, they had to show their teachers in 3 different ways that they had met their goals. And one of the students had a video camera set up on a chair very precariously, where she was demonstrating how she was solving a mathematical problem as one of her sources of evidence for her teacher to show that she was reaching her goals. That's the kind of learning we know that really makes a difference. Yet a lot of our classrooms don't look like the picture I showed you, but actually the processes are not too different. So having that, the co- and self-regulated learning in relation to goals, it means co-constructing meaning rather than transmission, linking new ideas with existing ideas. This all comes from learning theory, and we know it works. Unpacking the misconceptions together, particularly in subjects like mathematics and science. What are the students' misconceptions that need to be corrected and changed in order for them to move on? Actively constructing new ideas and holistic frameworks, so it's not itemised knowledge. A lot of our secondary schools are very siloed. You learn graphs about graphs and mathematics, and then you learn about graphs in science or in geography, but the 2 teachers don't talk to one another to make sure that the language of the graphs in mathematics is taken over into into science and geography. They're 3 separate silos, and if the teachers don't connect it for the students, then usually the students have difficulty connecting it for themselves. Students taking joint responsibility. In this classroom of 9 and 10-year-olds that I was in a few weeks ago, students were taking total responsibility for their learning. In terms of, because they had the goals, they knew where to go. And feedback and feed forward. By feed forward, I mean, where to next? So this is where the teacher really comes in, is helping the student to identify, well, you've mastered this one, you've shown me in 3 different ways. So where are we going next with your learning? So why start with students? Because that is based on learning theory, and teacher learning in the past is not really that much different. And I hope in Sweden it is different now, but it's a bit like what I'm doing today, except I'm down the bottom here instead of on stage. And the learning today, and you've got, unfortunately, you've got the book to back it up to delve into it more. The ideas are very simple. But I've worked with schools over 3 or 4 years, and they're quite complex to put in place because it requires a lot of misconceptions to be put aside, and then other conceptions or understandings to be put in their place. And I was working with one school in Australia actually, and they had made a fantastic job, secondary school, in relation to one cycle of learning, and then they brought in a new area of learning and went back to the old transmission model, and then came to me and said, but it's not working. And so I asked them, of course, what are you doing? And I could see immediately why it wasn't working. The teachers did not have the buy-in, did not understand in the same way as they had in the first time round. So hopefully teacher learning now looks more like this. But it will only be successful in addressing those deep challenges if the work they have and the books they have in front of them in some way represent student learning or student well-being, their social well-being, some graphs, some it might be student work in English, might be, or in Swedish in your case, so that the students are represented in some way in that professional learning session. Another condition we have found that's important is there is some specialist expertise in that group. Teachers talk all the time to one another about students. If they could solve those real challenges on their own, they would have done it. Teachers don't sit passively and just turn up the next day. into class. They are very active learners. So it is important that for those teacher groups that there is someone with particular expertise bringing into them to develop the teacher's knowledge in relation to that challenge. The other reason for that expert, someone outside the group with expertise, and it could be someone from within the school, it doesn't need to be outside the school. But another reason for that person is sometimes to interrupt the social norms of the group. And what I mean by that is sometimes in New Zealand, our teachers, when faced with lower achieving students, start to look at the students. Well, they're coming from a poor background. Oh, their parents don't care. Yes, they're late for school a lot. That may be all true, but that doesn't actually enhance their learning. So it's putting those together and saying, this is where they're at. How can we progress this learning? So sometimes those conversations need to be interrupted. But if teachers are problem solving, and I said, and that's why I said, what's your challenge that you have some control over? Problem solving, how to improve the learning of those students that they've got represented on their desks, then they're likely to be more effective. So teachers need to be able to also answer the question, where are we going with our learning, our professional learning? What do we need to learn in order to teach our students, those students that we're really struggling with? How are we doing in relation to that? How are we doing in relation to our professional learning goals and the students on their goals? So it's the teachers that's got a double layer related to it. And where to next? What do we need to learn next in order to enhance the learning of our students? Just to briefly overview the research that I'm basing this on, is that I conducted an international analysis of the evidence in relation to professional development. The synthesis was commissioned by our Ministry of Education. We're lucky in New Zealand because we are so small. We only have about 4.5 million people. That there is usually quite a close connection and relationships between policy, researchers and practice. And it's in some ways quite unique in our country, the closeness of that working relationship. It doesn't always work. Sometimes politicians particularly decide that something should be introduced because we all live in democracies and we have elections and priorities change. But on the whole, we do have a good relationship. So the Ministry of Education commissioned this international research and international analysis. What was so disappointing for me was how few studies of professional development followed through from the professional development to what the teachers learned, to what they changed, to outcomes for students. In fact, when I asked people, do you have any studies related to that? Many of them said, well, you couldn't possibly track it through. Well, I found 97 studies that did track it through, and they had in common what I'm going to talk about. And we identified their characteristics associated with improved outcomes. And as I was doing the synthesis, I also had a research and development role in a literacy professional development in New Zealand, a different one from the one I talked about before. And so we kind of tried out, we did this as part of the synthesis, then we tried out some of the things in practice on the ground with teachers and leaders and students. And we were very relieved that we got such stunning results. So there was 3 cohorts of 100 schools. On average, the students improved 2 to 3 times the expected rate. And what I mean by the expected rate was nationally, so we took the national norms of what was expected, because all students learn and progress, or most of them do. And this was 2 to 3 times that graph of usual progress. What we were particularly pleased about was that the lowest 20% accelerated much faster. In literacy, it was in reading, it was 3 times the rate. In writing, it was 5 times the rate of others' progress. So we were particularly pleased about that because that's our national problem. And we followed through a sample of schools in the first cohort over 3 years, and 15 schools, and in 13 of those schools the gains were sustained with new cohorts of students coming through. And after the external support had completely stopped. So we were relieved it worked. I was very nervous when we got the first lot of achievement back, and I thought, well, am I telling everybody how to do something that actually has no impact? We've also have many non-academic examples. As I say, I think the non-academic outcomes are just as important. In secondary schools, managing student behaviour, helping students to become independent, reflective learners. Actually, that was a school in England, in London. In primary schools, we've used it for inclusion of children with special needs and integrating immigrant students into the education system in terms of improving their outcomes. You're familiar with this book? I didn't have the cover of the Swedish one, but maybe I can put it in, because the one on the left was the research from the ministry. It's on a website by the ministry, and then the one in the middle was the book that was mentioned, and the one on the right is just a little slim volume commissioned by UNESCO that is for sort of readers, what we call the Reader's Digest version, if you want a quick read. Any questions so far? Any comments anyone wants to make? I said I'd stop and give you a chance. No? Okay, maybe after you've had a chance to talk to one another, you will. I'm moving on to something that I mentioned in the book, but I have done a lot more work on since. And it's because I've come to realise that this way of learning actually is underpinned by a notion of professionalism that many teachers do not hold, because it's different from a traditional notion of what it means to be professional. So that's what I mean by professionalism. What does it mean for us to be a professional teaching leader or whatever? The notion I want to put forward is not one that I started, that I invented. It came in the United States. As teachers, as adaptive experts, with the references there. But I have developed it since then. One of the issues is the committed to promoting the learning of each student. Many of our teachers, as I mentioned earlier, in the professional development, which didn't make a difference. The teachers were not actually concerned about the learning of each student. They were in the sense that they gave them extra work, they gave them time, they were committed to them, but they weren't really committed in their own learning how to teach each student. Those ones that didn't go so well, they'd say, well, I do these things, but really they're not making much progress, so what else can I do? Adaptive experts are constantly seeking relevant knowledge and skills to achieve this. I suspect that you, the people here, are adaptive experts, or you wouldn't be here probably. But I mean constantly in the sense that you're always, and the third bullet point there is seeking evidence on the impact of practice on student learning, and by that I mean the social, emotional and academic. And when you find that there's areas that you're not working so well, then you go and seek the relevant knowledge. One of the key words in here is seeking knowledge. So it's not someone else deciding that a teacher or a leader should go to some professional development, but it's driven by the teacher or the leaders need to know how to reach those students that they're not reaching that they're not reaching.